Hey everyone, today we're sewing the cross-tie top. The cross-tie top features a clean modern silhouette with a softly fitted shape and distinctive panel detailing. The front bodice is divided by curved cross seam lines that create a subtle structure, while the boat neckline gives the design an elegant minimal feel. The back features an adjustable tie detail at the lower panel, allowing you to slightly cinch the waist for a more defined silhouette. For your main fabric, this top works best with crisp, lightweight, non-stretch woven fabrics. For best results, fabrics that hold a press well are recommended, as pressing plays an important role in achieving clean seam lines and a polished finish. These are all the tools and materials you'll need for this project. Let's get started. Prep your fabric by pre-washing, drying, and ironing your fabric before cutting out your patterns. If your fabric is delicate, stretchy, or prone to shifting, stay stitching is recommended to help maintain shape and prevent ripping. First, we're going to cut and apply a 2 cm wide strip of fusible interfacing along the wrong side of the center back edge of the center back panel, extending 26 cm up from the bottom edge. Next, fold the front and back facing in half vertically and mark the center neckline point on the wrong side. Next, overlock the indicated edges of the back center panel, the front and back facings, and the back hem facing. Do not trim while overlocking and follow the pre-cut edges as they are. We're now going to assemble the front bodice panel. Place the front top panel and front bottom panel right sides together and sew with a 1.5 cm seam allowance. We'll finish the seam with a flat felt seam. First, trim more than half of the seam allowance from the front top panel only. If you're using a rotary cutter, I find it easier to put the upper panel underneath and cut it this way. Then, press the seam allowance of the bottom panel upward so it wraps around the trimmed seam allowance, making the folded edge meet at the original seam line without crossing over it. Then, fold the seam allowance up once more so the previous stitch line sits right along the folded edge, enclosing the raw edges inside. Press the seam allowance flat. Unfold the panels again and neatly arrange the folded seam allowance so it is directed toward the top panel. Finish by top stitching 2 mm from the folded edge. While top stitching, gently pull the fabric to each side to keep the original seam line from being caught underneath and to achieve a clean finish. We're going to join the two completed front panel halves together along the center front. Place the panels right sides together and sew with a 1.5 cm seam allowance. As before, the seam will be finished with a flat felt seam. This time, trim more than half of the seam allowance from the right panel only. Then wrap the left seam allowance around it. fold it over once more and press flat. Unfold the panels and finish by top stitching 2 mm from the folded edge on the wrong side. We will finish the hem first with a baby hem. On the wrong side, fold the hem up by 1 cm and press. For easier pressing, draw a guideline 2 cm up from the hem edge, then fold the edge up to meet the line. Sew a row of stitching close to the folded edge. Then, trim the upper seam allowance down to 5 mm. Using the newly cut raw edge as a guide, fold the hem up once more and press. Finish by sewing a second row of stitching just below the previous stitch line. Now we will join the upper back panels. Place the center panel and side panel right sides together, then sew with a 1.5 cm seam allowance. We're going to finish the seam with a flat fill seam just like the front panels. First, trim the seam allowance on the side panel side. Then wrap it with the seam allowance from the center panel side and press. Fold it over once more, press again, and finish with a 2 mm top stitch along the folded edge. Next, we will join the two back panels together at the center back. On one wrong side, mark a point 23 cm up from the bottom edge of the center back. Place the two pieces right sides together and stitch from the top edge up to the mark with a 1.5 cm seam allowance. Backstitch several times at the mark point to secure the seam, as this will prevent the seam from coming undone in the next step. Press the seam allowance open, then press the entire 1.5 cm seam allowance area all the way to the bottom edge. Open the zipper, and from the wrong side, press the zipper teeth flat with an iron. Next, mark a point 1.5 cm up from the bottom edge seam allowance. Then, mark the wrong side of the zipper just above the top zipper stop. There is a soft area near the top of the zipper that folds easily, which can help you find the marking point more easily. Mark the seam allowance 1 cm above the end of the previous stitching. Then, align the panels as shown in the video, with the left seam allowance folded and the right seam allowance opened back out. Place the right side of the zipper against the fabric upside down. First, match the marking on the zipper with the marking at the bottom of the back panel. Then, align the zipper teeth so that they sit directly against the pressed fold line, and carefully secure the zipper in place with pins. You can also use basting stitches or wash-away tape instead of pins to make the zipper easier to sew accurately. Switch to an invisible zipper foot, then sew all the way up to the marked point at the top. Pin the other side in the same way. Take extra care with this side, as inaccurate pinning can cause puckering. Compare side by side with the zipper side you have already sewn and adjust as needed. Then, using an invisible zipper foot, sew from bottom to top again. Press from the outside if needed. Now we'll finish the end of the zipper. Prepare a small self fabric piece measuring 5.5 cm by 3 cm. On the wrong side, fold up the lower edge of the longer side by 0.5 cm. Fold it in half with right sides together, aligning the ends. Then, sew with a 0.5 cm seam allowance. Press the seam allowance you just made open. Then, trim the seam allowance at the folded side diagonally. Trim the excess zipper tape, leaving about 3 cm beyond the stitched end. Insert the zipper end fabric over the end of the zipper with the folded edge positioned at the bottom. Position the open seam allowance at about the center of the zipper backside. Stitch 0.5 cm from the end. Then, turn the fabric right side out. Top stitch a straight line at the bottom about 3 mm from the edge. If the fabric gets caught in the machine, place tearaway paper underneath as shown in the video to make stitching easier. After finishing the zipper, we're going to use the back hem facing to finish the hem. Mark both back hem facings 5 cm from the center back edge along the long lower edge. Open the zipper and unfold the zipper tape and seam allowance open. With right sides together, align the back hem facings to the lower edge of the garment. Starting at the side seam, sew toward the center back with a 1.5 cm seam allowance, stopping at the marked point on each side. Flip the back panel with the partially sewn facing so the opposite side is facing up. At the center back, shift the back panel 1 cm past the facing edge and secure it with pins. Sew a straight stitch 5 mm away from the zipper teeth. Then, carefully fold the fabric back toward the facing along the zipper teeth so the fabric can settle into place naturally. The excess fabric created by the previous offset will now lie flat naturally. Repeat on the other side. Keeping everything secured in place, sew the remaining hemline section with a 1.5 cm seam allowance to connect it continuously. After stitching, trim the seam allowance diagonally at the corner. Fold the seam allowance toward the facing before turning it right side out for a cleaner corner. After turning the facing inside out, press the bottom hem nice and crisp. Top stitch 2.5 cm above the hem to secure the back hem facing in place. Moving on to the facings, on the wrong side, draw the seam line 1.5 cm in from the shoulder edges on both the front and back facings. Place the front and back facings onto the assembled front and back panels right sides together. Match the center notch at the neckline with the center seam line. Sew the neckline and armholes with a 1 cm seam allowance, but stop at the previously marked shoulder seam line. Next, trim the neckline and armhole seam allowances down by about half. Next, we are going to understitch the neckline and armholes. With the seam allowance directed outward, lift the facing and press along the seam line. Then we're gonna stitch the seam allowance to the facing at 2 mm from the seam. Since the shoulder areas cannot be fully turned, start from the accessible sections and stitch along the curves. As you approach the shoulders, continue only as far as possible. Turn the facing to the inside through the shoulder openings. Then, press along the edges. Next, fold and press the shoulder seam allowances on both the front and back facings. Place the front and back panels right sides together, then sew only the outer shoulder seam allowances of the main fabric layers. Be careful not to catch the facing layers while sewing. Trim the sewn shoulder seam allowances in half. Then, tuck and conceal it inside toward the front-facing side. Next, unfold and tuck the front-facing seam allowance inward toward the back-facing side. Fold the remaining back-facing seam allowance inward toward the back side as well. If needed, press it lightly with an iron to help it settle into place. Then secure it with pins. Finish the inner shoulder connection using a ladder stitch with a matching color thread. Hide the knots at the beginning and the end of the stitching inside the facing so they are not visible from the outside. Moving on to the tie straps, first fold the tie strap piece in half lengthwise with the wrong sides together and press. Unfold it, then fold both long edges inwards so they meet closely along the press center crease, and press again. Finally, fold it in half once more, enclosing the raw edges, and press. Unfold the center crease, then trim the outmost folded edge on the left side diagonally. With the left side folded and the right side unfolded, fold the end inward along the diagonal edge. Then fold the center line closed once again. Then, fold the opened edge back in, placing it between the previously folded end and the outer side of the strip. Only one end of the tie strap will be exposed, so finish just one end in this way. Repeat on the other strap and finish by top stitching 2mm along the edge to secure the opening. Moving on to the back tie panels, lay out the 4 back tie panel pieces in matching pairs. On one side, mark a point 2 cm down from the top along the center back edge on the right side of the fabric. Place the unfinished edge of the tie strap just below this marking, then place the matching tie panel piece on top with right sides together. Pin the layer securely as the tie strap area can shift easily while sewing. Sew along the red dashed line using a 1.5 cm seam allowance. Trim the 2 corner seam allowances diagonally first to reduce bulk. Then, trim the remaining seam allowances down by about half as well. Repeat on the other side, then turn both pieces right side out. Use a long blunt tool to gently push out the corner from the inside. Then, press the 3 sewn edges neatly with an iron. Now we'll join the side seams. Turn the bodice wrong side out and place it with the back side facing up. First, unfold the facing ends along the side seam area, then pin the front and back panels together continuously from top to bottom. Then bring in the tie panel piece, match up the bottom edge exactly to the bottom of the front panel, and pin upward from bottom to top. Where the tie panel overlaps with the back panel, place it over the back panel and pin again to secure it. Then, sew the side seam continuously with a 1.5 cm seam allowance. Then, finish the seam with an overlock while trimming 5mm. After sewing, press the seam allowances toward the front panel. Then, top stitch the seam allowance in place continuously from the facing down to the hem with a 0.7 cm seam allowance. Place the facing back into its original position. From the inside, secure the facing at the side seam by pinning approximately 1 cm above the facing hem edge. Then, return to the outside and add a small securing stitch, backstitching about 3 stitches directly over the existing top stitch line where the pin is placed. And there we have our cross tie top completed. Perfect for your summer wardrobe. For the pattern link and detailed illustrated instructions, check out the description box below. If you share your make, tag Cross Tie Top and Moon Archive on Instagram so I can see and feature your work. Thanks for watching.